Who are these people?
Hey everybody, welcome back as an extra story from me, Reef Breland, and my co-host Collin Radix-Carter of
Why did you sound like
Newsroom.
you were struggling there?
Me, it's just you got to shake off the cobwebs, Um,
You just
but
did this last week.
yeah, but that was last week. Um, anyway, I just wanted to get your opinion on stuff while there's opinions to be had. Um,
Sure.
But since you're a teacher at the age where these books are probably appropriate, to some degree, but this is a article from Kit Knightley over at Off Guardian. Roald Dahl, the first man down the memory hole. So it starts. The first shocking censorship of 2023 dropped last week as covered by CJ Hopkins in his most recent column. Roald Dahl's publishers have hired a team of sensitivity readers in order to edit the next edition of Dahl's books to remove outdated language.
I
According to
think
the
you need
piece, oh,
Conan, you need to move the screen
there we
over.
go.
Yeah.
I thought I aimed that well enough. According to this piece in the New Statesman, the changes range from the removal of outright racist stereotypes to the deletion of the word fat gendered phrases, be it chambermaid, females, or hag, and references to pink or white skin. In some cases, these are minor tweaks to one or two words in a sentence. Others are far more interventionist, including entire songs rewritten in James and the Giant Peach, or new sentences added in The Witches, which explain that there are a myriad reasons why people might wear wigs. Um, while that may read like a PC nightmare, it's more insidious than that. This is not about being woke or unwoke. It's about the normalization of post hoc censorship that should concern everyone. Some have described the edits as a natural byproduct of capitalism. It has been noted that the edits in the wake of the Dahl estate closing a huge deal with Netflix for exclusive rights to all of Dahl's work, so some are framing this as Netflix seeking to protect their investment by making sure Dahl remains profitable in the age of cancel culture. But even as that is a simplification, um, after all, Netflix is more than just an entertainment company. They have noted political ties and have relentlessly pushed state backed propaganda in the past. Even the choice of Dahl as the man to lead a forlorn hope down the memory hole is carefully calculated. His known racist attitudes make him controversial enough that some will hesitate to defend his work, while the fact he was a children's author means anyone who does raise concerns can be dismissed with either indifference, it's just a kid's book, it doesn't matter, or false moralizing. We need to protect children. He's the perfect choice to be laid down on the wire. And if they set a precedent that it's now okay to go back and revise language, what's next? Who's next? Dickens? Twain? What about the news? That's the big ticket item after all, right? What words will no longer be acceptable next year? Inside job? Guantanamo Bay? What history will be deemed offensive? What facts will be potentially harmful? Um, we've already had a little taste of this with COVID, with the death rate of the 1918 Spanish flu was suddenly revised down in February 2020 to literally physically impossible numbers just to make COVID appear more dangerous. Mainstream precedents would allow this process to switch from small covert examples to much larger overt ones. In other book-related news this week, it was widely reported that the UK's government anti-terror program Prevent had placed, among others, Shakespeare, Tolkien, and George Orwell on their list of key texts that could radicalize right wing extremists. Somewhat ironically, this practice of retroactive censorship is a tactic straight out of 1984. No wonder they don't want us to read it. It doesn't create extremists, but it does give away their plans. Thoughts, Care Bear?
I was actually looking at something for you
Yes.
uh, for this, but while I'm looking for it, if I can find it, I think it's stupid.
Yes.
Um, yeah, it just goes. It's just the idea of censorship. You
Yeah.
know, the idea as in the article, it was like, if you start with this, how far would you go in terms of the rabbit hole, and which author would be next in terms of censoring their work. I mean, I read his books religiously. Like, I grew up in the UK during the time, and like that's what you read. Um, was Roald Dahl books.
Mm.
And you can argue that Roald Dahl's humor was dark, but there was never an issue, at least growing up for me, reading his books.
Yeah.
I know times are different now, but I think even now, kids still read them, and generally without any problems. So my thing is, if parents want to censor certain media for their kids, that's all well and good. That should be up to the parent.
Yeah.
But I think pushing pushing into that censorship game when you're trying to filter the words of an author, especially in this day and age, to kind of appease the PC crowd.
Yeah.
And at the same time, who asked for this? Nobody that I know asked for Roald Dahl's books in terms of what he wrote to be changed.
No,
So
I mean it's like I'm looking up now is like why like what's controversial about like James and the Giant Peach, for instance. Like the grasshopper declares at one point, I'd rather be fried alive and eaten by a Mexican. You know?
right.
So stuff like that, like of course, I mean Roald Dahl, we talked about this before doing the segment about his upbringing, because I read those books growing up and it included like autobiographies written by him, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he grew up in like a rural area of the UK, but still was capable of going to like boys' homes for school, headmasters, stuff like that. Their family was able to afford a car when those were fairly new, so it was like definitely upper wealthy, upper middle class, by the very least, still rural though. Um, but I think you could argue those are books of the time, right? Like, I'm sure there's a
Right.
ton of stuff that's probably insensitive, but like that's something to like feel like it's better to explain that to children reading it if it comes up, you
Right.
know, and like to explain that that's what that was then. But we're not allowed to say that, especially in Florida now, right?
Right.
So because then we have to talk about how to fix it, and they don't like teaching that. But um, I don't know. It's just more. Do you feel as a teacher that you're like what even at your level that you are going to be controlled in what you teach, even in the books you read in that regard, even in DC?
That worry is happening, really, in terms
Mm.
of that's always been my argument. I think just overall, in terms of not necessarily being able to teach within the full extent of what I really want to say. Um, like, um, and I gave this example, I think, before on stream. I did a unit on Dr. King with my class last year,
Mm.
and they were able to figure out, and I didn't tell them this, but just due to the questions and just due to the way the conversation was going, this was going over a course of like about a couple of weeks, I would say.
Okay.
Like I had a few kids who kind of were on it, and they basically put two and two together and were able to figure out like it was the government that killed Dr. King.
Right.
These were 4 and 5 year, and these were 4 and 5 year.
Yeah.
So they asked me that, and I didn't bring that up. They figured it out on their own. and and I had to. So in that case, I was able to tell them, but I wouldn't normally be able to just give away that information if it were up to
Right.
me.
Okay.
So, um, so yeah, I think even in that situation, um, I couldn't just straight up tell them. I mean, and look at the books that they read regarding that. They always say, like, oh, he was shot and he
Yeah.
died, basically, but never going into the specifics as to why, like, um,
Okay.
so I feel like there's room for teachers if they don't feel comfortable in that situation to not say anything and just kind of skirt that, or for teachers that do feel comfortable can, but that then also you have to kind of worry in terms of, and we've reported on this before, and actually I'm writing an article in relation to this, that if a principal comes in and if that's not necessarily on the books as to what you should be teaching, then you can get docked for that. You may not get a good of a review, which could affect your job. So you have to be very careful in terms of what you say and how you say it, as a teacher. So that's already been a thing, but I think it's just the outright blatant censorship where, as you said, um, teachers don't even have the opportunity to kind of teach into, yeah, like this was written at a time when this was more acceptable or whatever else, and it's not as acceptable now, but there's things that can still be enjoyed in terms of
Yeah.
reading an
Do you
author given
remember
the context, the
there was
time
a
that they were
Looney Tunes like DVD that got put out or whatever, and they had like Whoopi Goldberg came out like before the thing and be like, yeah, these were in their times. There may be depictions of things that don't represent how we feel now. Like, I feel like
yeah,
that can be done here without too
yeah,
much issue.
like yeah.
You
There's
know?
a Sesame Street. I think there was a Sesame Street, maybe DVD collection or something like that that was put out
Yeah.
maybe within the last, I'll say 7 years, I believe.
Mm,
But it was like it was almost kind of like, if I remember, like Sesame Street, like after dark. Like
right.
these were some of the older like uh segments that we watched growing up that would not be necessarily acceptable now.
Right.
But they tailored it for adults, which I thought was kind of interesting.
Yeah.
Because back then we would have been kids who would have seen these
Yeah.
segments. But the idea was like, oh, um, adults who are like kids who are now adults now, it would be more acceptable to them, but not for the kids who actually the show is written for now.
Right.
That, oh, it's not acceptable. So so those segments are no longer being shown today.
Mm,
But yeah, I think it just kind of goes with the signs of the times of things are censored. Things are becoming a lot more PC. There are certain things that you can't say anymore. So it makes it a lot harder, I think, especially in media. Like we talked about this regarding comedians, like the things that they were able to kind of get away with as far as a bit, like
yeah.
in the 80s and 90s and even early aughts, you can't say anymore,
Nope.
which is kind of disappointing. But I think that's also translated into the idea of like, that separation of, this is a comedian. This is meant to be either satirical or funny or whatever else, or
Right.
dig society, that, and people having, you know,
Well, to
the
me, it's
wherewithal to kind
also
of think beyond that, but
like no
can't do
one's
that.
getting rid of the Bible depicts far worse things than Roald Dahl ever depicted, you know?
Right.
Like, and that's still available, you know, like that's my issues with a lot of this stuff is it's like it's
Well, the
morality
argument,
policing and you
right?
know.
The argument for the Bible is that you wouldn't necessarily find a Bible like in a public school per se.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
um, but yeah, you're right. It's the idea of, but then even then, it's like you kind of do it with the Bible now, like they're children's Bibles.
Yes.
So, so they're
Yep.
taking a lot of that,
Oh, and history
language,
books and things like
history,
that.
and
Like,
kind of censor that or censor or omit certain things so that kids are not necessarily reading that.
yeah.
So, so you can see that there too, but you're not going to
Well,
see that um in a you're not going to see a Bible necessarily in a public school
yeah.
on a shelf.
Um. Well, we'll see. We'll see what happens with this. I'll check back on this kind of stuff. But I think that about covers it. You know, we have good guests lined up next week, so tune in for those, hopefully. And anything else, Care Bear?
No.
Okay. Oh, I remember. Labels are bad. Stay independent. Good night, fam.